Hello, my name is William Kincade Miller. Today I will be presenting my Indigenous Two-Spirit podcast. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this presentation takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Wet'suwet'en and Mi'kmaq peoples. Two-spirit identities are often misunderstood through Western perspectives. They're framed gender only within a binary system of male and female. However, many indigenous nations had long histories of recognizing multiple gender roles before colonization. In this presentation, I will explore how gender diversity exists in indigenous societies prior to colonization, how colonized systems attempted to suppress these identities, and how healing culture, reconnection, and helping reclaim two-spirit identities today. I will also connect some of this discussion to my own life experiences, to stories shared in our courses readings, including experiences discussed by Heavy Runner in our textbook. The term Two-Spirit is a modern pan-Indigenous term that was adopted in 1990 at an Indigenous gathering in Winnipeg. It was created to describe Indigenous peoples whose identities may include elements of both masculine and feminine spirit, or who take on roles in their communities that move beyond Western gender categories. However, the concept itself is not new. Long before colonization, many indigenous nations had their own words and teachings describing gender diversity. Two-spirit identities were often connected to spiritual roles, healing practices, or community leadership. Colonization disrupted these traditional understandings by imposing European Christian beliefs that rejected gender diversity and enforced strict gender binaries. Understanding this history is important because it helps explain how colonial systems shaped attitudes towards gender and sexuality within indigenous communities. Two-spirit identity is often misunderstood when it is explained only through Western frameworks of sexuality or gender identity. In Western society, discussions about identity are often separated into categories like sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. However, in many indigenous cultures, these ideas were not separated in the same way. Instead, identity was often understood through relationships with community, spirituality, culture, and natural world. The term Two-Spirit was adopted in 1990 at an Indigenous LGBTQ gathering in Winnipeg as a way to reclaim Indigenous understandings of gender diversity and distinguish them from Western LGBTQ labels. While this term itself is not modern, the identities and roles it refers to are not new. Many Indigenous nations historically recognized people who embodied both masculine and feminine qualities or lived in ways that moved beyond strict gender categories. These individuals were often respected members of their communities. In some nations, Two-Spirit people held important roles such as healers, mediators, spiritual leaders, caretakers of ceremonies, or keepers of culture knowledge. Because they were seen as carrying both masculine and feminine spirits, they were sometimes understood as having unique perspectives or spiritual gifts that helped maintain balance within the community. It is also important to recognize that the meaning of gender diversity varied widely between different indigenous nations. Each nation had its own language, teachings, and cultural roles related to gender. The modern term Two-Spirit is therefore an umbrella term that connects these traditions while acknowledging that each community has its own specific teaching and understanding. Understanding Two-Spirit identity requires looking beyond Western gender frameworks and recognizing the deep culture, spiritual, and community responsibilities that these roles have historically held within Indigenous societies. Before colonization, many Indigenous societies recognized gender diversity as a natural and accepted part of community life. Gender roles were not always limited to a strict male-female binary like those imposed later through European colonial systems. This image on the slide shows Oshtish, also known as finds them and kills them, a well-known two-spirit person from the Crow Nation. Oshtish lived in the 19th century and was recognized with Crow society as someone who embodied both masculine and feminine roles. Oshtish is known historically for participating in battle alongside male warriors, while also carrying out social and cultural roles that were traditionally associated with women within Crow society. Their contributions to the community were respected and valued. Oshtish life demonstrates gender diversity was not viewed as abnormal or deviant in many indigenous communities. Instead, it was integrated into everyday social and spiritual life. At the same time, it's important to recognize that Oshtish was not the only two-spirit person in history. There were many two-spirit ancestors across different indigenous nations whose stories were never recorded or were lost because of colonial suppression. I chose to acknowledge Oshtish here because their story has been documented and helps illustrate the broader reality that gender diversity exists long before colonialization. In many indigenous traditions, people who embody both masculine and feminine spirits were sometimes understood as having special responsibilities or perspectives that help maintain balance within the community. Stories like this remind us that gender diversity is not a modern invention. It is a deep historical roots within indigenous cultures. What changed was not indigenous culture itself, but the colonial system that attempted to erase these identities and replace them with European gender norms. Research also shows that indigenous traditions often connect identity to culture, teachings, and land. For example, Gigria Land and Johnson, 2012, explained that traditional beliefs play an important role in shaping indigenous identities and moving communities to protect culture, traditions, and land. When Europeans colonized North America, they brought with them a very different belief about gender and sexuality than those held by many indigenous societies. European Christians' teachings emphasize a strict binary system of gender. In this system, people were expected to clearly fit into either male or female roles, and those roles came with very specific expectations about behavior, family structure, and social responsibilities. Because of this worldview, European missionaries and colonial authorities often viewed indigenous gender diversity as immoral and sinful. Identities and roles that existed in many indigenous communities, including what we now refer to as two-spirit identities, challenged these rigid gender expectations. As a result, colonial systems worked to suppress indigenous understandings of gender and identity. Culture, teachings, ceremonies, and social roles connected to gender diversity were discouraged or actively punished. Scholars have described this process as coloniality of gender. Dominique Hughes and colleagues explained that colonial system imposed European gender frameworks onto indigenous societies in ways that disrupted traditional understandings of identity, spirituality, and community roles. These colonial gender systems didn't just affect individuals, they reshaped entire communities by replacing the indigenous teachings with European Christian beliefs about gender, family, and morality. One of the most powerful tools used to enforce these colonial ideas was the residential school system, which I'll talk about in my next slide. One of the most significant ways colonial governments attempted to enforce European gender systems and erase indigenous identities was through the residential school system. Residential schools were created as a part of colonial policies designed to assimilate indigenous children into European culture. For a century, indigenous children across Canada and the United States were forcibly removed from their families and placed in institutions run by churches and government authorities. Within these schools, children were forbidden from speaking their language, practicing their culture, traditions, or expressing their identities in ways connected to their communities. These institutions were not simply designed to provide education. Their purpose was to remove children from their culture environments and reshape them according to European beliefs about religion, identity, and gender roles. One of the first things that often happened when children arrived at residential school was the cutting of their hair. In many indigenous cultures, hair carries deep and spiritual meaning and represents connection to identity, family, and community. Cutting a child's hair was not just a physical change. It symbolized the forced separation from culture, traditions, and ancestral identity. Within residential schools, strict European gender norms were enforced. Children were divided into rigid categories of boys and girls and were expected to follow highly structured gender roles. These expectations reflected European Christian beliefs about masculinity and femininity and the family structures rather than indigenous understandings of identity. Scholars have described this process as a part of what is known as the colonial gender. Dominique Hughes and his colleagues 2025 explained the colonial system imposed Western gender frameworks on indigenous communities in ways that normalized European ideas of gender while marginalizing indigenous identities and expressions. These colonial systems created hierarchies that privileged Western understandings of identity and attempted to erase indigenous culture knowledge. For individuals who may have naturally expressed gender diversity or two-spirit identities, these environments could be especially harmful. Residential schools enforced strict divisions between boys and girls and punished behaviors that did not conform to European gender expectations. As a result, many traditional teachings and culture roles connected to two-spirit identities were disrupted, hidden, or lost over generations. The suppression of language, ceremony, and cultural teaching also disrupted the transmission of knowledge that had historically supported gender diversity within many indigenous societies. Understanding the role of residential school helps us recognize the marginalization of two-spirit identities did not originate within indigenous cultures themselves. Rather, it was largely the result of colonial systems that attempted to erase indigenous knowledge and impose European beliefs about gender identity and social roles. Recognizing this history is important because it helps explain why reclaiming culture, teachings, language, and traditional understandings of identities to continue to be an important part of healing and culture revitalization within indigenous communities today. When we talk about two-spirit experiences today, it's important to understand the idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to how different aspects of a person's identity overlap and shape their lived experiences. For two-spirit individuals, identity often exists at the intersection of several different factors. These may include indigeneity, gender identity, sexuality, culture, spirituality, and the historical impacts of colonialization. Because of this, two-spirit people have experienced multiple forms of discrimination at the same time. For example, they may face racism as indigenous people while also experience homophobia and transphobia within broader society. In some cases, they may also encounter misunderstanding within their own communities because colonial systems disrupted traditional teachings about gender diversity. Intersectionality helps us understand that these experiences cannot be separated into single categories. Instead, they overlap and shape how individuals navigate the world. The image on the slide reflects indigenous culture, life, and community traditions. Images like this remind us that identity within indigenous communities is often connected to culture, ceremony, and relationships within the community. For many people, including two-spirit individuals, identity is not gender or sexuality, but also about connection to culture, spirituality, and ancestral traditions. Research by Parmenter and colleagues 2025 explored that these kinds of intersectionality experiences among queer and trans, black, indigenous, and people of color. Their study found that resilience within these communities often comes from collective support, culture connection, and shared resistance to oppression. Participation in the study described resilience not simply as an individual strength, but as something rooted in community relationships, culture, identity, and mutual care. This perspective challenges Western ideas that often frame resilience as something individuals must handle on their own. Instead, the research shows that the healing often comes through reconnecting with community, culture, and shared identity. Understanding intersectionality helps us recognize that the experience of two-spirit people today are shaped not only by gender and sexuality, but also by broader historical and social systems that continue to affect indigenous communities. When we talk about resilience within indigenous communities, it is important to understand that resilience is often collective rather than individual. In many Western perspectives, resilience is often described as an individual ability to overcome challenges on one's own. However, many indigenous worldviews emphasize relationships and community as central to healing and strength. For Two-Spirit individuals, resilience often comes from reconnecting with community, culture, and traditional teachings that may have been disrupted by colonial systems. Cultural traditions, ceremonies, language, and relationships with elders and family members can all play important roles in strengthening identity and supporting healing. Research by Parmenter and colleagues 2025 highlights this idea in their study on intersectional resilience among queer and trans, black, indigenous, and people of color. The research found that resilience is in the communities and is often rooted in collective experience such as mutual care, culture identity, and shared resistance to oppression. Participants in the study described resilience as something that grows through community relationships and culture connection rather than something individuals must carry alone. This perspective reminds us that healing from colonial trauma is not only an individual process, but also a collective one. Communities create spaces where people can reconnect with culture, identity, and one another. For many Indigenous people today, rebuilding these networks of support and cultural connection is an important part of reclaiming identity and strengthening resilience. For me, the idea of culture, connection, and resilience is not just theoretical. It is something I have experienced personally in my own life, which I'll talk about in the next slide. For me, learning about Two-Spirit identity and the impacts of colonial gender systems is not just an academic topic. It is also something that connects to my own life and experiences. I have a Two-Spirit brother, and seeing his experiences helped me understand how important acceptance, respect, and cultural understanding are within our communities. Historically, many Indigenous cultures recognized and respected gender diversity, but colonial systems disrupted those teachings and created a lot of misunderstanding that still affects people today. Growing up, some of my most meaningful experiences were spending time out in the forest with my Musham. Being out in the land with him gave me a sense of peace and connection that difficult to fully explain. When I was in the forest, I felt connected not only to nature but also to my ancestors and to the culture teachings that comes from being close to Mother Earth. However, there's a period in my life where I lost touch with those traditional roots. I drifted away from the culture teachings and that had grounded me growing up. When that happened, it felt like I had stepped off the red road onto many people referred to as the black road. Reconnecting with my culture, spending time with the land again, and participating in traditional teachings helped me bring myself back closer to Mother Earth, and reconnecting with those teachings helped guide me back onto the red road. That experience showed me personally how powerful culture connection can be. Healing is not just about individuals. It often happens through relationships with community, culture, and the land. For me, this topic is not just about understanding history or research. It's about recognizing how culture, teachings, community support, and connection to the land continue to play an important role in healing and identity today. To conclude, Two-Spirit identities have long been recognized and respected within many Indigenous cultures. These identities were not seen as outside the community, but were often understood as an important part of social, culture, and spiritual life. However, colonial systems introduced rigid gender roles that disrupted those understandings. Through institutions such as residential schools, religious teachings, and government policies, Western ideas about gender were imposed on Indigenous communities. This led to the suppression of identities that had previously been respected. Today, many Indigenous communities are working to reclaim those teachings and restore the respect that Two-Spirit people historically held. Reconnecting with culture knowledge, community support, and traditional teachings play an important role in that process. Understanding the history is important because it reminds us that gender diversity is not a new concept. Instead, it existed for generations and continues to be an important part of Indigenous cultures and identities today. Thank you very much for your time. I've included all the sources used in this presentation in the reference slide.